I showed up to Christmas dinner with a broken arm. What happened to you? They all asked. You'll see, I said quietly. My son laughed. She was a bit difficult yesterday, so my wife had to teach her a little lesson. Right then, the doorbell rang. I pulled out my recorder, smiled at him, and opened the door. Good evening, officer. Come right in. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Let me tell you how I got here, because this story didn't start with my arm in a sling and my daughter-in-law in handcuffs. This story started 3 years ago when my husband Frank died and left me with nothing but a paid-off house and a son who thought I was his personal retirement plan. The thing about being 67 years old is that everyone assumes you're either helpless or invisible. I'm neither, but I let people think what they want to think. It makes life easier, and it definitely made this plan work better than I ever imagined it would. Frank and I had been married for 42 years when his heart gave out. We'd been nurses together at County General for 30 years before we retired. We knew how to handle crises, how to stay calm when everything was falling apart around us. Frank always said I had the steadier hands in emergency situations. Turns out he was right about that too. After the funeral, my son Kevin started coming around more often. Kevin's 38 years old, works in sales, and has never met a get-rich-quick scheme he didn't love. His wife Brittany is 35, hasn't worked a day since they got married, and believes the world owes her a lifestyle that costs about twice what Kevin earns. Mom, you shouldn't be living alone in this big house, Kevin said 2 weeks after we buried his father. What if something happens to you? What if you fall down the stairs or have a medical emergency? I was washing dishes from the casseroles people had brought. Kevin was sitting at my kitchen table, drumming his fingers the way he used to do when he wanted something as a kid. I've been taking care of myself for 67 years. Kevin, I think I can manage a few more. But he kept pushing. Every conversation became about my age, my health, my safety. Brittany would chime in with stories about elderly people who died alone and weren't found for days. They painted such vivid pictures of my impending doom that I almost started believing them myself. The real reason became clear 3 months later when Kevin brought up selling the house. Mom, property values in this neighborhood have really gone up. You could make a nice profit and move somewhere smaller, more manageable. And where exactly would I move? I asked. He and Brittany exchanged one of those looks that married couples share when they think they're being subtle. Well, we've got that spare room upstairs. You could stay with us for a while, just until you find the perfect place. That's when I knew. This wasn't about my safety or my health. This was about my house, my small savings account, and their belief that I'd be grateful enough to hand everything over to them eventually. The old Margaret would have said no firmly but politely. The old Margaret would have changed the subject and hoped they'd drop it. But Frank's death had changed something in me. Maybe it was grief, maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was finally seeing people clearly for the first time in my life. Let me think about it, I said. That night, I sat in Frank's chair and looked around our living room. Every piece of furniture held a memory. The coffee table Frank built when Kevin was 10. The bookshelf where we'd displayed Kevin's school photos and soccer trophies. The corner where we'd put up Christmas trees every year for 40 years. Kevin called the next morning before I'd finished my coffee. Mom, we talked about it more last night, and we really think this is the best solution for everyone. You'd have family around. Brittany could help with your medications and doctor appointments, and you wouldn't have to worry about maintaining that big old house anymore. He was using his sales voice, the one that had convinced dozens of customers to buy things they didn't need. But I'd heard that voice for 38 years. And I knew what it meant. What about rent? I asked. Silence. Then, rent? Mom, we're family. You don't need to pay rent. So I'd sell my house, move in with you for free. And then what? What happens to the money from selling the house? Another pause. Well, you'd need that for your expenses, your medical bills, your personal needs. And maybe you could help us with some of our expenses too. The mortgage, utilities. It would all balance out. There it was. They wanted me to sell my house, move in as free labor and a financial contributor, and slowly drain my savings until there was nothing left. Then what? They'd find some reason why I needed to go to a nursing home that cost exactly as much as my remaining assets? I told them I needed more time to think. Kevin's patience started wearing thin after that. His visits became more frequent and more pressure-filled. Brittany started making comments about how expensive home maintenance was, how dangerous it was for elderly people to live alone, how much safer I'd be with family. But the moment I knew for certain what kind of people they really were was the day I fell down the front porch steps carrying groceries in. I didn't break anything, just bruised my hip and scraped my hands, but I was shaky and scared. Kevin found me sitting on the steps trying to collect the scattered groceries. Instead of asking if I was hurt, his first words were, "Mom, this is exactly what we were talking about. You can't keep living like this. What if you'd broken something? What if you'd hit your head?" He helped me inside, got me some ice for my hip, and made me tea. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd been wrong about his motives. Maybe he really was just worried about me. Then, Brittany arrived. "Oh my God, Kevin, look at this place. She can barely take care of herself, let alone this house. The kitchen faucet is dripping, there are water spots on the bathroom mirror, and I saw dust bunnies under the coffee table." She was walking through my house like a real estate agent evaluating a property, pointing out everything that needed attention, making mental notes of what had value and what didn't. "This is a sign," she told Kevin, as if I wasn't sitting right there. "She needs to move in with us before something really bad happens." That's when I understood. They weren't waiting for me to agree to their plan. They were waiting for me to become desperate enough that I'd have no choice but to agree. And you know what? I decided to give them exactly what they wanted. I moved in with Kevin and Brittany on a rainy Thursday in October, 3 months after Frank died. They helped me pack what they called my essentials: clothes, medications, and a few personal items. Everything else would stay in the house until we decided what to do with it. The spare room they'd prepared for me was actually Brittany's craft room, hastily cleared out. Her cutting table was now folded against one wall, her fabric bins stacked in the closet, and her sewing machine covered with a sheet in the corner. She'd hung one of those little wooden signs that said, "Home Sweet Home," on the wall. The kind you buy at craft stores when you want something to look welcoming, but don't want to put in any actual effort. "I know it's not much," Brittany said, standing in the doorway while I unpacked my suitcase. "But it's temporary, right? Just until we find you something perfect." Perfect. I folded Frank's old sweater and put it in the dresser drawer that smelled like Brittany's vanilla candles. "It's fine, dear. I appreciate you making room for me." The first week was all performance. Brittany cooked meals she'd seen on Pinterest and acted like having me there was the highlight of her day. Kevin brought me coffee in bed and asked how I'd slept. They introduced me to their friends as Kevin's mom, who's staying with us while she transitions to a smaller place. Transition. Like I was a displaced refugee instead of a woman who'd owned her own home for 40 years. But by the second week, the mask started slipping. Little things at first. Brittany would sigh heavily when she had to move her craft supplies to get to something in the closet. Kevin would mute the TV with his jaw set tight when I asked what we were watching. They'd have whispered conversations in the kitchen that stopped abruptly when I walked in. The rules started in the third week. "Mom," Kevin said over breakfast, "Brittany and I talked, and we think it would be better if you didn't use the main bathroom during peak hours. You know, when we're getting ready for work, or when we have guests coming over. There's a half bath downstairs that would probably be more convenient for you anyway." The half bath was a cramped space under the stairs with no natural light and a toilet that ran constantly. But I smiled and said that sounded reasonable. The next rule came a few days later. I couldn't use the living room TV during prime time hours because that's when Kevin and Brittany relaxed after work. I could watch TV in my room if I kept the volume low since their bedroom was next door. Then it was the kitchen. I could cook for myself, but I needed to clean everything immediately and put all utensils back exactly where I found them. Brittany had a system that worked perfectly, and she couldn't have it disrupted. Each rule was presented as a reasonable request for a harmonious household. Each rule made perfect sense when explained in Kevin's patient, understanding voice. Each rule made me a little smaller, a little more invisible, a little more grateful for whatever scraps of consideration they threw my way. But I went along with it. I smiled and nodded and thanked them for being so accommodating, because I was learning something valuable about my son and his wife, something that might have taken me years to discover if I'd stayed stubborn and independent in my own house. I was learning that they weren't just entitled and selfish. They were bullies who had found the perfect victim. The physical abuse started small, too. A hand on my shoulder, that pressed a little too hard when Brittany needed to get past me in the kitchen. Kevin gripping my elbow tighter than necessary when he helped me down the stairs. Little pushes disguised as playful nudges that left me off balance and apologizing for being in the way. I started paying attention to how they talked to each other when they thought I couldn't hear. Brittany would complain about having to babysit me when Kevin worked late. Kevin would grumble about how much extra their grocery bill had gone up since I moved in, even though I gave them $500 a month for expenses. One evening in November, I overheard them in their bedroom through the thin walls. I'd been pretending to sleep, but their voices carried clearly through the cheap drywall. "She's not that old," Brittany was saying. "My grandmother is 93 and still lives alone. Your mom is just dramatic and helpless because your dad always babied her." "Give it time," Kevin replied. "She'll get more dependent as she settles in. Then we can start talking about power of attorney and financial management. For her own protection, of course." There it was. Their real plan. Not just my house and savings, but complete control over my life and finances. They wanted to turn me into a legal dependent who couldn't make decisions without their approval. I lay in that narrow bed, listening to my son and his wife plan my future like I was a piece of property they were renovating, and I felt something crystallize inside me. Not anger exactly. Anger was too hot, too emotional. This was colder and much more useful. This was determination. The next morning, I started my own plan. I'd been a nurse for 30 years. I understood how institutions worked, how documentation mattered, how evidence needed to be collected and preserved. I understood that people revealed their true selves when they thought no one important was watching. And I understood that sometimes the best way to stop a predator was to let them think they'd found the perfect prey. I went to the electronics store and bought a small digital recorder, the kind that looked like a pen. I bought a tiny camera that could be hidden in a button or a pin. I bought software that would automatically back up recordings to a cloud server. The salesperson, a young man with multiple tattoos and infinite patience, helped me set everything up and taught me how to use it all. "Doing some investigative work?" he asked with a grin. "Something like that," I said. "I want to make sure I have accurate records of some important conversations." That evening, I sat in my craft room turned bedroom and tested the equipment. The recorder picked up conversations from across the hall clearly. The camera was invisible when pinned to my cardigan. The backup system worked perfectly. I was ready to document exactly who my son and daughter-in-law really were. The evidence I collected over the next few months would have made a prosecutor weep with joy. Kevin and Brittany didn't just reveal their plans. They bragged about them. They talked about me like I was a project they were managing, discussing how to manipulate me into signing documents, how to isolate me from my friends, how to convince me that I was too confused and frail to live independently. But the most valuable evidence came from their actions, not just their words, because by December, they'd stopped pretending to care about my well-being altogether. By Thanksgiving, I'd recorded over 30 hours of Kevin and Brittany discussing their plans for my money, my house, and my future. But what I really needed was evidence of physical abuse, and they were too smart to leave obvious marks where people might see them. That changed the week before Christmas. I was in the kitchen making myself a cup of tea when Brittany came home from what she called her workout, which was actually 2 hours at the nail salon followed by coffee with her sister. She was in one of her moods, the kind where nothing was right and everyone was to blame. "Why are all these dishes in the sink?" she demanded, even though the only thing in the sink was my teacup from breakfast. "I was just about to wash it," I said, reaching for the cup. "Don't." Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Just don't. You can't do anything right, can you? You leave messes everywhere, you use up all the hot water, you make noise at all hours. I'm sick of living in my own house like I'm the guest." I had my recorder running, as I did every day now, but I could see in her face that this was going beyond verbal abuse. Her hands were clenched, her breathing was quick and shallow. She was working herself up to something. "Brittany," I said carefully, "I'm sorry if I've made you uncomfortable in your home. Maybe we should sit down and talk about—" "Talk?" She laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. "I'm done talking. I'm done pretending the situation is working for any of us." She grabbed my arm, just above the elbow, and squeezed, hard enough that I gasped and tried to pull away. "You're hurting me," I said. "Am I?" She squeezed harder. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're just being dramatic. Again. I could feel her fingernails digging through my sweater. The pain was sharp and immediate, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was what I'd been waiting for. Evidence that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. Please let go, I said clearly, making sure my words would be picked up clearly by the recorder. Or what? You'll tell Kevin? You'll call someone? She was leaning closer now, her voice low and mean. Who's going to believe a confused old woman over his wife? Who's going to take your side against us? That's when I made a mistake. I met her eyes, and she saw something there that she didn't expect. Not fear, not confusion, not the helpless desperation she was used to seeing from me. She saw calculation. Her grip loosened slightly. What's that look supposed to mean? Nothing, I said, trying to soften my expression. I just want to get along, Brittany. I don't want any trouble. But it was too late. She'd seen behind my mask for just a split second, and now she was suspicious. Her eyes narrowed as she studied my face, looking for something she couldn't quite name. You're recording this, aren't you? She said suddenly. My heart stopped, but I kept my face blank. Recording what? This conversation. You've got some kind of device on you. She started patting down my sweater, looking for a wire or a phone. I knew something was off. You've been too calm, too agreeable. That's not normal for someone in your situation. Her hands found the pen recorder in my pocket. She pulled it out and stared at it, her face going pale. Kevin! She shouted. Kevin, get in here right now! I heard his footsteps on the stairs, quick and heavy. He appeared in the kitchen doorway still wearing his work clothes, his tie loosened around his neck. What's wrong? He asked, looking between us. Brittany held up the recorder. Your mother's been recording us. She's been spying on us in our own home. Kevin's face went through several expressions. Confusion, realization, and finally anger. The kind of cold, calculating anger that I recognized from his father, but Frank had never directed it at me. Mom, he said quietly, what is this? It's a recorder, I said. There was no point in lying now. How long have you been recording us? I thought about lying, about minimizing, about trying to explain it away. But standing there with Brittany's fingerprints still burning on my arm and my son looking at me like I was a stranger, I decided I was tired of pretending. Since November, I said. November. Kevin's voice was flat. You've been recording us for over a month. Yes. Why? I looked at both of them. These two people who had taken me into their home, not out of love, but out of greed. Who had systematically isolated and humiliated me while planning to steal everything I had left in the world. Because I wanted to understand who you really are, I said. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Then Kevin moved, faster than I expected. He grabbed my wrist, twisted it until I cried out and yanked the recorder out of my other hand. You ungrateful bitch, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. After everything we've done for you, after opening our home, changing our entire lives to take care of you, this is how you repay us? His grip was cutting off circulation to my hand. I could feel my fingers starting to tingle. Kevin, please. Shut up. He was breathing hard now, his face flushed with rage. Just shut up and listen to me. You're going to tell me where the recordings are stored. You're going to delete all of them, and then you're going to apologize for violating our privacy and trust. And if I don't? He twisted my wrist harder. The pain shot up my arm like electricity. If you don't, I'll have you declared mentally incompetent. I'll tell everyone you've been having paranoid delusions, recording imaginary conversations, making up stories about abuse. Who do you think they'll believe? A successful businessman and his respectable wife, or a confused old woman living in their spare room? Brittany was nodding along, her eyes bright with vindictive pleasure. We've been documenting your behavior too, Margaret. All those times you seemed confused about where you were. All those conversations where you repeated yourself or forgot what we'd just told you. We've been keeping detailed notes. Notes that don't exist, I said. Notes that will exist, Kevin corrected. Backdated. Witnessed by friends who'll swear they saw concerning behavior. Medical records that show cognitive decline. It's amazing what people remember when their friends ask them to help protect a vulnerable elderly person from making dangerous decisions. They had it all figured out. If I exposed them, they'd destroy my credibility and take control of my life anyway. If I didn't expose them, They'd slowly drain my resources and dump me in whatever facility was cheapest when I was no longer useful. But what they didn't know was that I'd spent 30 years documenting medical cases where family members abused vulnerable patients. I knew exactly how their strategy worked because I'd helped doctors and social workers build cases against people just like them. And I'd learned something important from those cases. The abusers always got overconfident. "Okay," I said quietly. "You win. I'll delete the recordings." Kevin's grip loosened slightly. "Smart choice. Where are they stored?" "On the recorder and on my phone." "Get your phone." I pulled out my phone with my free hand and started tapping through the menus, pretending to look for the files. What I was actually doing was sending a pre-written text message to a number I'd programmed weeks ago. "It's taking a while," Brittany said impatiently. "I'm not very good with technology," I said, which was perfectly true 3 months ago and a complete lie now. "I'm trying to find the right app." I hit send on the message, then deleted the evidence of sending it. "Here," I said, showing them a folder on my phone that contained some test recordings I'd made of myself reading grocery lists. "But I should tell you there's a backup system." Kevin snatched the phone out of my hand and deleted the folder without listening to the files. "Where's the backup?" "In the cloud. Automatic upload. I don't know how to delete those." That was when Brittany lost what was left of her temper. She slapped me. Hard. Hard enough that my head snapped to the side and I felt my lips split against my teeth. "You stupid old woman!" she screamed. "How dare you? How dare you spy on us and then try to threaten us with backup files?" Kevin was staring at her, shocked by the escalation. "Brittany, no!" She was completely unhinged now. "I'm sick of tiptoeing around her feelings and pretending this is normal. She's been recording us for months, Kevin. Recording us in our own bedroom, probably listening to our private conversations, planning to use them against us somehow." She hit me again, this time with her closed fist, right in the stomach. I doubled over, gasping, and she grabbed a handful of my hair and yanked my head back up. "Delete the backup files," she snarled into my face. "Figure out how to delete them, or I swear I'll make you sorry you ever set foot in our house." What she didn't know was that I was already sorry I'd ever set foot in their house. But I was about to be very glad I'd had the foresight to prepare for this moment, because the text message I'd sent was going to change everything. The text message I sent said exactly 4 words. "Emergency plan active now." Dr. Jennifer Walsh received it while she was having dinner with her family. She'd been my primary care physician for 8 years, and more importantly, she'd been Frank's doctor during his final illness. She knew me well enough to know I wasn't prone to drama or false alarms. More importantly, she knew that 6 weeks earlier, I'd come to her office with a carefully planned story about being concerned about my safety living with Kevin and Brittany. I told her I was documenting potential elder abuse, and I'd asked her to serve as a neutral medical witness if I ever needed to prove I was mentally competent and physically harmed. She'd agreed, and we'd set up a protocol. If I ever sent her that specific text message, she would call 911 and request a welfare check on an elderly woman potentially being abused by family members. Then she would drive to the address I'd given her and wait for police to arrive. At the same time my text was being sent, a second message went to my lawyer, Marcus Chen, who I'd hired 5 weeks earlier. Marcus received a message that said, "Documentation package required." This triggered him to send a pre-prepared email containing 37 audio files, 42 photographs, and a detailed written report to the police department, with copies to Adult Protective Services and the district attorney's office. But Kevin and Brittany didn't know about any of this, as Brittany continued to rage at me in their kitchen. "I want to see these backup files," she was saying, her hands still tangled in my hair. "Show me exactly where they're stored." "I can't," I gasped. "I don't remember the password." She jerked my head back harder. "Then you'd better remember it fast." That's when Kevin grabbed her wrist. "Brittany, stop. This isn't helping." "Isn't helping what?" She whirled on him, her eyes wild. "She's been recording us. She's probably got hours of us talking about money, about the house, about everything. We could go to prison." "Only if we did something wrong," Kevin said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Are you kidding me right now?" Brittany laughed, high and sharp. "Look at her face. Look at your hand. Look at what we just did. You think a jury's going to care that she was spying on us first?" For the first time since this started, Kevin seemed to really see me. My split lip, the bruises forming on my arm where he'd gripped me, the terror I wasn't having to fake anymore because honestly, seeing them completely lose control was terrifying even when you'd planned for it. "Oh God," he whispered. "What have we done?" "What we had to do," Brittany snapped, "and what we're going to keep doing until this problem is solved." She turned back to me, and I saw in her face that she'd moved past anger into something much more dangerous. She was calculating now, planning, trying to figure out how to eliminate a threat. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice artificially calm. "You're going to tell everyone that you fell down the stairs, that you're getting confused and clumsy, and you think you need to be in a care facility for your own safety. You're going to sign papers giving Kevin power of attorney so he can handle your finances and medical decisions. And you're going to disappear into whatever nursing home we choose until this all blows over." "And the recordings?" I asked. "Will disappear too, along with that lawyer you probably hired, and anyone else you might have told about your paranoid fantasies." The doorbell rang. We all froze. The sound cut through the kitchen like a gunshot, unexpected and sharp. "Who could that be?" Kevin whispered. "I don't know," Brittany hissed back. "We're not expecting anyone." The doorbell rang again, followed by a heavy knock. "Police! Open up!" If I hadn't been expecting it, I might have been as shocked as Kevin and Brittany. As it was, I had to work hard to keep the relief off my face. "Police?" Kevin's voice cracked slightly. "Why would police be here?" The knocking continued, more insistent now. "This is Officer Rodriguez with County Police. We're conducting a welfare check. Please open the door." Brittany was staring at me with dawning understanding. "You called them. Somehow you called the police." "I couldn't have called anyone," I said truthfully. "You had my phone." "Then how—" "Open the door immediately or we'll be forced to enter," came the voice from outside. Kevin looked between me and Brittany, panic replacing anger in his eyes. "What do we do?" "We answer the door," Brittany said grimly. "And we explain that this is all a misunderstanding, that Mom had a little fall, got confused, and somehow the police got called by mistake." She leaned down until her face was inches from mine. "And you're going to back up that story. Because if you don't, if you try to tell them some fantasy about abuse, I promise you'll regret it. We know people, Margaret. We know lawyers and judges and social workers. We can make your life a living hell in ways you can't even imagine." The knocking was getting louder. I could hear multiple voices now, and what sounded like a radio crackling. "They're not going away," Kevin said, his salesperson composure finally cracking completely. "We have to answer." Brittany straightened up and smoothed her hair. In the space of 30 seconds, she transformed from a woman in the middle of assault back into a concerned daughter-in-law dealing with a family crisis. It was impressive and terrifying to watch. "Remember," she said to me quietly, "one word about recordings or abuse, and you'll spend the rest of your life wishing you'd stayed quiet." Kevin walked to the front door with Brittany close behind him. I could hear their voices change as they approached the entryway, becoming warmer, more concerned, more normal. "Officers," Kevin's voice carried back to the kitchen, full of confused surprise. "Is everything all right? We weren't expecting—" "Mr. Thompson, we received a call about a possible domestic disturbance involving an elderly resident." "Domestic disturbance?" "Oh my goodness, no. There must be some mistake. My mother lives with us, but there's certainly no—" "Is she here now?" "Yes, she's in the kitchen. She had a little fall earlier, but we'd like to speak with her, please." I heard footsteps approaching and quickly checked my appearance in the reflection from the microwave. My lip was swollen, and there was a small cut where my teeth had sliced through the skin. The marks on my arm were already darkening into bruises. I looked exactly like what I was, a victim of domestic violence. 3 police officers entered the kitchen. The first was a tall Hispanic man with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. Behind him was a shorter white woman with graying hair who immediately looked at my injuries with professional assessment. The third was a young black man who was already taking notes. "Ma'am," the first officer said gently, "I'm Officer Rodriguez. We received a call about your welfare. Can you tell me your name?" "Margaret Thompson," I said clearly. "And are you hurt, Mrs. Thompson?" Behind the officers, I could see Kevin and Brittany in the doorway. Brittany's eyes were locked on my face, her expression promising consequences if I said the wrong thing. This was the moment everything depended on. This was where I had to decide whether I was brave enough to see this through, whether I trusted the system I'd spent months preparing to support my story. I looked at Officer Rodriguez's kind face, then at the female officer who was clearly experienced in domestic violence cases, then at Kevin and Brittany, who were holding their breath waiting for my answer. "Yes," I said quietly. "I am hurt, and I'm scared." The officers exchanged glances. The woman stepped closer to me, while Rodriguez turned to face Kevin and Brittany. "Sir, ma'am, I'm going to need you to wait in the living room while we speak with Mrs. Thompson privately." "Now wait just a minute," Kevin started, his sales voice kicking in automatically. "This is our house, and that's my mother. If there's been some kind of misunderstanding—" "There's no misunderstanding," the female officer said firmly. "This is a welfare check on a vulnerable adult. We need to speak with her alone. Please wait in the living room." After they left, Officer Rodriguez pulled out a small recorder, ironically similar to the one Kevin had taken from me. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Officer Rodriguez. This is Officer Chen, and Officer Williams is taking photographs. We're going to record this conversation for everyone's protection. Is that all right with you?" "Yes," I said. "Can you tell me what happened to your face and arm?" I took a breath and began telling the truth for the first time in months. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in the back of an ambulance while a paramedic named Tom checked my injuries and photographed them for evidence. Through the open doors, I could see Kevin and Brittany being questioned separately by police officers. Brittany kept gesturing wildly with her hands, her voice getting higher and more defensive. Kevin was using his calm, reasonable tone, but I could see sweat stains under his arms even though it was December and cold. "You've got bruising consistent with finger grip marks here on your upper arm," Tom said, gently manipulating my elbow. "And this split lip is fresh. When did these injuries occur?" "About an hour ago," I said. "Any other injuries we should know about?" I rolled up my sleeve and showed him the bruises from the past few weeks. Yellow and green ones that were healing, darker ones that were newer. Tom photographed each one carefully and made detailed notes on his tablet. "Mrs. Thompson," he said quietly, "I've been doing this for 15 years. These injuries are consistent with ongoing physical abuse. I'm glad you called for help." "I didn't call," I said, "but I'm glad someone did." He looked at me curiously, but didn't ask follow-up questions. That's when Dr. Walsh appeared at the ambulance doors. "Margaret, thank goodness. Are you all right?" Officer Chen, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward. "Ma'am, are you family? I'm Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Margaret's primary care physician. She sent me an emergency text, so I came right over." Chen looked at me. "You sent a text message?" "Yes," I said. "To Dr. Walsh. We had arranged a safety protocol in case I ever felt I was in immediate danger." "When did you arrange this?" 6 weeks ago. I went to Dr. Walsh because I was concerned about my living situation here. I asked her to help me document potential abuse." "Doctor." Walsh pulled out her phone and showed Officer Chen the message I'd sent. "Emergency plan active now. We agreed that if I ever received this specific message, I would call 911 and come to the address immediately." "And why did you feel you needed this kind of safety protocol?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for months. This was where my careful documentation would either save me or fail me completely. "Because my son and daughter-in-law have been physically and emotionally abusing me while planning to steal my assets," I said clearly. "And I've been recording evidence of it for 2 months. The reaction was immediate. Officer Chen called Officer Rodriguez over, and I found myself explaining the whole story again while Dr. Walsh confirmed my mental competency and Tom continued documenting injuries. "Where are these recordings now?" Rodriguez asked. "My lawyer has copies of everything. His name is Marcus Chen, no relation to Officer Chen, I assume. I hired him 5 weeks ago specifically to handle the evidence I was collecting." Rodriguez was taking notes rapidly. "And you say you've been planning this for 2 months?" "I've been documenting abuse for 2 months. I've been planning my escape from an abusive situation. Tonight wasn't supposed to happen yet. But when they found my recording device and became violent, I had to activate my emergency plan earlier than intended." Officer Chen's radio crackled. She answered it, then looked at Rodriguez. "Detective Morrison is en route. He wants to speak with the complainant before she goes to the hospital." "Hospital?" I asked. "Ma'am, You need to have these injuries properly documented and treated. Standard protocol in domestic violence cases. Dr. Walsh nodded. I'll follow you there and make sure you get a complete evaluation. That's when I heard Kevin's voice getting louder from the front yard. This is ridiculous. She's confused and paranoid. We've been taking care of her out of the kindness of our hearts, and this is how she repays us? By making up stories and wasting police resources? I looked toward the sound of his voice and saw him gesturing toward the ambulance. Several neighbors had come outside to see what was happening. Mrs. Peterson from next door was standing on her front porch in her bathrobe, arms crossed, watching the whole scene. Brittany was crying now, or at least making crying sounds. She's been acting so strange lately, she was telling Officer Williams. Paranoid, forgetful, talking to herself. We've been trying to figure out how to get her the help she needs. But she's been resistant to seeing a doctor about her mental state. That's interesting, Dr. Walsh said loudly enough for Brittany to hear. Because Margaret has been seeing me regularly, and her mental status has been completely normal. In fact, she scored perfectly on cognitive assessments as recently as last week. Brittany's fake crying stopped abruptly. She stared at Dr. Walsh with obvious confusion. Who are you? Brittany demanded. I'm Dr. Walsh, Margaret's physician. And you are? I'm her daughter-in-law. I live with her. I think I'd know better than some doctor who sees her once in a while whether she's been acting strange. Dr. Walsh pulled out her phone again. I have detailed notes from 6 separate appointments where Margaret specifically discussed her fears about being abused by family members. I also have cognitive assessments, depression screenings, and medication reviews that show no signs of mental impairment or confusion. Officer Rodriguez walked over to join the conversation. Ma'am, are you saying Mrs. Thompson has been telling her doctor about abuse for weeks? Since November 3rd, Dr. Walsh said, consulting her phone. She came in asking me to help her document what she believed was escalating elder abuse. She was articulate, logical, and showed no signs of paranoia or delusion. She was planning ahead to protect herself. The neighbors were getting closer now, clearly listening to every word. I could see Mrs. Peterson whispering to her husband, and the young couple from across the street recording everything on their phones. Kevin's face was getting redder by the minute. She never told us she was unhappy. She never said anything about abuse. If she was really being hurt, wouldn't she have said something? Most victims of domestic abuse don't report it immediately, Officer Chen said matter-of-factly. Especially elderly victims who are financially dependent on their abusers. They often feel they have no choice but to endure the situation. But we're family, Brittany protested. We took her in when she had nowhere else to go. We've been supporting her, feeding her, giving her a place to live, while planning to steal her house and life savings, I said quietly from the ambulance. The yard went completely silent. Even the neighbors stopped whispering. Kevin and Brittany stared at me with identical expressions of shock and fury. That's... Kevin started, then stopped. That's what? Officer Rodriguez prompted. That's not true, Kevin finished weakly. I have recordings, I said. Hours of them. Conversations about how to manipulate me into signing over power of attorney. Discussions about selling my house, plans to have me declared mentally incompetent if I resisted, and physical abuse that escalated tonight when they found out I was documenting everything. Officer Chen was writing furiously in her notebook. These recordings, they cover what time period? November through today. My lawyer has copies of all of them, along with photographs of previous injuries and detailed documentation of the psychological abuse. Detective Morrison chose that moment to arrive. He was a tall, thin man in his 50s who looked like he'd seen every kind of family dysfunction imaginable and wasn't surprised by any of it anymore. What do we have? He asked Officer Rodriguez. Elderly victim of domestic abuse, ongoing situation for several months, has recordings and medical documentation. Lawyer has evidence packages. Suspects are son and daughter-in-law who appear to have financial motives. Morrison nodded and walked over to the ambulance. Mrs. Thompson, I'm Detective Morrison. I understand you've been planning this for quite a while. I've been protecting myself, I corrected. I hoped it wouldn't come to this. But yes, I prepared for the possibility. Smart woman. Are you willing to press charges? I looked across the yard at Kevin and Brittany. Kevin was staring at the ground, probably calculating whether he could afford a good lawyer. Brittany was still trying to look like the victim, but her performance was getting less convincing by the minute. These were the people who had taken me in not out of love but out of greed, who had isolated me, humiliated me, and tonight had physically assaulted me when they realized I wasn't the helpless victim they thought I was. "Yes," I said firmly. "I want to press charges for assault, elder abuse, and fraud." Morrison nodded and signaled to the other officers. "Read them their rights." As Kevin and Brittany were handcuffed and placed in separate police cars, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't feel victorious or vindicated. I felt profoundly sad, because no matter how this ended, I'd lost my son, the little boy I'd raised, the young man I'd been proud of, the adult I'd hoped would take care of me in my old age. That person either never existed or had died somewhere along the way, replaced by someone who saw his own mother as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. But as the ambulance doors closed and we pulled away from Kevin and Brittany's house for the last time, I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Safe. The hospital emergency room was surprisingly quiet for a Friday night in December. Dr. Martinez, the attending physician, examined my injuries while Officer Chen and Detective Morrison waited outside my treatment room. Dr. Walsh had followed the ambulance and was consulting with the hospital staff about my medical history. "You're going to have significant bruising for the next week or two, Doctor," Martinez said as she applied antibiotic ointment to my split lip. "The finger marks on your arm are textbook examples of grip injuries. I'm going to recommend some x-rays to make sure there's no damage to the underlying bone." "Is that necessary?" "Mrs. Thompson, you're 67 years old. Elder abuse injuries can be more serious than they initially appear, especially if there's been ongoing violence. I want to make sure we document everything properly for the legal case." While I was getting x-rays, Marcus Chen arrived. My lawyer was a small, energetic man in his early 40s who specialized in elder law and had built his reputation by taking on families who abused vulnerable adults. "Margaret," he said as I was wheeled back from radiology, "I sent the documentation package to Detective Morrison an hour ago. 47 audio files, 36 photographs, financial records showing their plans to fraudulently gain control of your assets, and medical documentation of escalating abuse. What happens now? Now they get arrested, formally charged, and we make sure they never have access to you or your assets again. I've already filed for an emergency restraining order that will prevent them from contacting you or entering your property." Dr. Walsh appeared in the doorway. "How are you feeling, Margaret?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," I said honestly, "but also like I can breathe again for the first time in months." "I've been reviewing the recordings Marcus sent me," she said. "The psychological abuse alone would be enough to support criminal charges. Combined with tonight's physical assault and the financial fraud they were planning, the prosecutor should have a very strong case." Detective Morrison knocked on the doorframe. "Mrs. Thompson, can I ask you a few more questions?" "Of course." He sat down in the visitor's chair and pulled out a small recorder. "I've been reviewing the evidence your lawyer provided. This is impressive documentation. How long have you been planning this?" I thought about that question carefully. "I started recording in November when I realized they were planning to steal from me. But I think I started really planning my escape the day I moved in with them and saw how they looked at me." "What do you mean?" "They looked at me like I was a problem to be solved, not a person to be cared for. Everything they did after that was about managing me, not helping me. I just needed time to prove it." "And the emergency plan with Dr. Walsh?" "I knew that if they ever found out I was documenting their abuse, they'd escalate to violence. I needed witnesses who could verify my mental competency and respond quickly if I was in immediate danger." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. A lot of elder abuse victims don't have the resources or the presence of mind to plan ahead like this." "I was a nurse for 30 years, I said. "I've seen what happens to elderly people who don't advocate for themselves. I wasn't going to become another statistic." Dr. Martinez returned with my x-ray results. "Good news, no fractures, but you're going to be sore for a while. I'm prescribing some pain medication and muscle relaxants. You'll need to follow up with Dr. Walsh in a few days to monitor the healing process." "Doctor," Detective Morrison said, "in your professional opinion, are these injuries consistent with Mrs. Thompson's account of assault?" "Absolutely. The bruising pattern, the timing, the mechanism of injury, everything supports her statement. These are defensive injuries combined with grip marks from someone holding her against her will. After Dr. Martinez left, Marcus pulled up a chair next to my hospital bed. "Margaret, we need to talk about next steps. You can't go back to Kevin and Brittany's house, obviously. Do you have somewhere safe to stay?" I realized I hadn't thought beyond getting away from them. "I suppose I could get a hotel room until I figure something out." "What about your own house?" Dr. Walsh asked. "You never sold it, did you?" "No, it's still mine. Kevin and Brittany kept saying we needed to wait for the right market conditions. I think they were hoping I'd become dependent enough on them that I'd sign it over without selling it." "Then you can go home," Marcus said. "I'll have the locks changed tomorrow as an additional security measure. But legally, it's your house, and you have every right to live there." Home. I hadn't thought of my house as home since Frank died. It had been the place I used to live, the place I'd been pressured to leave, the place that represented everything I'd lost. But suddenly, sitting in that hospital bed with my split lip throbbing and my arms aching from Kevin's grip, the idea of going home sounded like the most wonderful thing in the world. What about Kevin and Brittany? They're being booked tonight on charges of elder abuse, assault, and conspiracy to commit fraud. They'll probably be released on bail tomorrow, but the restraining order will be in effect by then. They won't be allowed within 500 feet of you or your property. Detective Morrison closed his notebook. "Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that this is one of the most well-documented elder abuse cases I've ever seen. Between your recordings, the medical evidence, and the financial documentation, the prosecutor should be able to secure convictions on multiple felony charges." "What kind of sentences are we talking about?" "Elder abuse with physical violence can carry up to 7 years in prison. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult is another 5 years. Conspiracy charges could add more time. Even if they plea bargain, they're looking at significant jail time and substantial fines." After everyone left, I lay in the quiet hospital room and tried to process what had happened. 6 months ago, I'd been a grieving widow being pressured by her son to give up her independence. Tonight, I was a domestic violence survivor who had successfully documented her own abuse and escaped from her abusers. The woman who had moved in with Kevin and Brittany in October would never have believed she was capable of planning and executing something like this. That woman had been passive, trusting, willing to believe the best of people even when they showed her who they really were. But that woman had also been stronger than she knew. She'd survived 30 years as a nurse, 42 years of marriage, the death of her husband, and the betrayal of her son. She'd learned to be invisible when necessary and fierce when required. I touched my split lip gently and smiled, even though it hurt. Tomorrow I would go home to my own house, sleep in my own bed, and start rebuilding the life that Kevin and Brittany had tried to steal from me. But tonight, for the first time in months, I was safe. I went home on Saturday morning. Marcus met me at the hospital and drove me to the house I hadn't seen since October. As we pulled into the driveway, I felt a complex mix of emotions I wasn't prepared for. The house looked smaller than I remembered, and older. The winter garden beds I'd normally have cleaned up by now were full of dead leaves and broken stems. The front porch light was still on from when I'd left months ago, now a beacon that had been burning uselessly for weeks. But it was mine. No rules about bathroom usage or TV time. No walking on eggshells around people who saw me as a burden. No recording devices hidden in my clothing because I was finally, truly safe. Marcus had arranged for a locksmith to meet us there. While new locks were being installed, he went through the house, checking that everything was secure and intact. "Looks like they haven't been here," he said, emerging from the basement. "No signs of disturbance or theft." "They were waiting for me to sign power of attorney before they started moving my assets," I said. "They wanted everything to look legal and legitimate." My phone rang. Dr. Walsh's number appeared on the screen. "Margaret, how are you feeling this morning?" "Sore, but glad to be home." "Good. I wanted to let you know that Detective Morrison called me this morning. Kevin and Brittany were released on bail a few hours ago, but they've been served with restraining orders. They're not allowed to contact you or come within 500 feet of your property." "What if they violate the order?" "Then they go back to jail immediately, and their bail gets revoked. Morrison said to call 911 if you see them, or if they try to contact you in any way." After Dr. Walsh hung up, Marcus finished reviewing the legal paperwork with me. The restraining orders, the criminal charges, the steps we'd take to ensure they couldn't access my financial accounts or medical records. What about the house they're living in? I asked. It's mortgaged, and I was paying part of it. Marcus smiled grimly. That's their problem now. You have no legal obligation to continue supporting their lifestyle, and given the circumstances, I doubt any judge would order you to do so. So they'll lose the house? Probably. Kevin makes decent money, but not enough to cover their full mortgage payment, plus legal fees for 2 criminal defense attorneys. They're about to discover what financial stress feels like. After Marcus left, I walked through my house alone for the first time in months. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. Frank's reading chair by the window, his books still on the nightstand, his coffee mug still in the sink waiting to be washed. I'd been afraid to disturb anything when I moved out, as if changing his space would somehow make his death more final. Now I realized that keeping everything frozen in time hadn't preserved his memory. It had prevented me from healing. I spent the afternoon cleaning and reorganizing. I washed Frank's mug and put it away in the cabinet with the others. I moved his books to the shelf and put my own books on the nightstand. I rearranged the living room furniture so it faced the window instead of the TV, creating a reading nook that was mine instead of ours. Sunday morning, Mrs. Peterson called. "Margaret, dear, I'm so glad you're home. I saw the police cars Friday night and I've been worried sick. Is everything all right?" Mrs. Peterson had been our neighbor for 20 years. She was a retired teacher in her 70s who still walked her dog twice a day and kept track of everyone on the street. "There was some trouble with Kevin and Brittany," I said carefully, "but it's been resolved." "Trouble? Honey, I saw them being arrested, and I heard some of what you told the police officers. Are you telling me that boy was hurting you?" I'd forgotten how clearly sound carried in the evening air, and how many neighbors had been watching from their porches during the arrest. "Yes," I said simply, "but I'm safe now, and they can't come near me anymore." "Well, I never. And here I always thought Kevin was such a nice young man. Shows how wrong you can be about people." She paused. "Margaret, you know you can call me if you need anything, right? Day or night. I'm right next door." "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. That means a lot. And honey, good for you for fighting back. A lot of women your age would have just taken it and suffered in silence." After I hung up, I realized that Mrs. Peterson's call was probably the first of many I'd be receiving. The arrest had been public, and in a neighborhood like this, news traveled fast. I decided to get ahead of the story. I called my sister Linda in Phoenix. Linda was 5 years younger than me and had always been the more dramatic of the two of us. I knew she'd want to know what had happened, but I also knew she'd worry herself sick if she heard about it from someone else. "Margaret, I was just thinking about calling you. How was your Thanksgiving with Kevin?" "Linda, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to the whole story before you react." I told her everything. The manipulation, the financial exploitation, the abuse, the recordings, the arrest. Linda was silent for so long, I thought the call had dropped. "Linda, are you there?" "I'm here." Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "I'm just trying not to get in my car and drive to wherever Kevin and Brittany are so I can kill them myself. They're in enough trouble already." "Are you really okay? Are you hurt? Do you need me to come stay with you?" "I'm hurt, but I'm healing, and I'm home in my own house with new locks and a restraining order. I think I'm going to be fine." "Margaret, I am so proud of you. You planned this like a military operation. You documented everything, you protected yourself, and you got out. I wish I'd known what was happening so I could have helped, but honestly, I'm not sure I could have done it better myself." That evening, as I sat in Frank's chair, watching the sunset through the clean windows, my phone rang again. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Detective Morrison. I wanted to update you on the case." "What's happened?" "Kevin and Brittany's lawyers contacted the prosecutor this morning. They're interested in plea bargaining." "Already?" "Your evidence is overwhelming, Mrs. Thompson. 47 recordings, medical documentation. Financial records showing their intent to defraud you. Their lawyers know they can't win this case at trial. They're going to try to minimize jail time by pleading guilty to reduce charges." "What does that mean for me?" "It means you probably won't have to testify in court. It also means they'll be convicted felons with criminal records, which will make it much harder for them to exploit vulnerable people in the future." After Morrison hung up, I made myself a cup of tea and sat down with a legal pad to make a list. Not a to-do list this time, but a list of things I wanted in my new life. I wanted to travel. Frank and I had always planned to see Europe after he retired, but cancer had stolen that dream from us. There was no reason I couldn't go alone. I wanted to volunteer. 30 years of nursing had taught me how to help people, and there were plenty of organizations that needed volunteers who understood healthcare and advocacy. I wanted to reconnect with friends I'd lost touch with after Frank died. Grief had made me withdraw from social connections, but isolation had made me vulnerable to Kevin and Brittany's manipulation. Most importantly, I wanted to trust my own judgment again. For months, I'd been told I was confused, paranoid, and unreliable. Even though I'd never believed it completely, the constant gaslighting had made me doubt my own perceptions. But I'd been right about Kevin and Brittany. I'd seen through their manipulation, documented their abuse, and planned my escape flawlessly. I wasn't a confused old woman who needed to be managed. I was a competent adult who had survived a dangerous situation through intelligence and careful planning. As I finished my tea, I realized I was looking forward to tomorrow for the first time since Frank died. Not just getting through tomorrow, but actually excited about what it might bring. Tomorrow, I would call a travel agent. Monday morning brought unexpected visitors. I was having coffee and reading the newspaper when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw two women I didn't recognize standing on my front porch. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Janet Morrison from Channel 7 News, and this is my cameraman Dave. We're doing a story about elder abuse, and we understand you recently survived a situation with family members. Would you be willing to speak with us?" My first instinct was to say no. The last thing I wanted was to become a poster child for victimized elderly people. But then I thought about all the other women my age who might be in similar situations, too isolated or intimidated to get help. "Give me a moment to think about it," I said through the door. I called Marcus. "A news interview could actually be helpful," he said. "Public awareness about elder abuse is important, and your story demonstrates that victims can fight back successfully. But you don't have to do it if you're not comfortable." What would I say? The truth, that elder abuse is real, that family members are often the perpetrators, and that victims need to document everything and seek help before it escalates to violence. I opened the door and invited the news crew inside. Janet Morrison was a woman in her 50s with intelligent eyes and a warm manner. She set up the interview in my living room and asked thoughtful questions that focused on the broader issues rather than sensational details. "Mrs. Thompson, what would you want other elderly people to know about recognizing abuse from family members?" "I would want them to know that financial pressure is often the first warning sign," I said. When adult children suddenly become very interested in their parents' living arrangements, their medical care, or their financial management, it's worth asking why. Are they genuinely concerned, or do they have their own financial motivations? "How did you find the courage to document the abuse?" I realized that no one was going to save me except myself. I could either accept being victimized, or I could gather evidence and fight back. At my age, I didn't have time to waste hoping things would get better on their own. What advice would you give to someone who thinks they might be in a similar situation? Document everything. Keep records of conversations. Take photographs of injuries. Tell trusted friends or medical professionals what's happening. And don't wait for the abuse to escalate to violence before seeking help. The interview aired that evening during the local news. Janet Morrison had edited it sensitively, focusing on prevention and empowerment rather than exploitation. She'd also included information about elder abuse hotlines and resources. My phone started ringing before the segment ended. "Margaret, it's Dr. Walsh. I just saw the interview. You were wonderful. I hope it helps someone." "I'm sure it will. You've already helped more people than you know." The next call was from Linda. "Margaret, you were on TV. You looked so strong and composed. I'm proud of you for speaking out." Then Mrs. Peterson. "Margaret, dear, you were amazing. I recorded it so I can show it to my book club. We've been talking about this exact issue, how to protect ourselves as we get older." But the call that meant the most came an hour later from a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Thompson, you don't know me, but my name is Carol Stevens. I saw your interview tonight, and I wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" "My daughter and her husband have been pressuring me to sell my house and move in with them. They keep talking about how dangerous it is for me to live alone. how I need family support. But after listening to your story, I'm realizing that their sudden interest in my welfare coincides pretty closely with their financial problems. What are you going to do? I'm going to call my lawyer tomorrow and make sure my affairs are in order, and I'm going to start paying closer attention to their behavior and motivations. We talked for 20 minutes. Carol was 73, a retired librarian whose daughter and son-in-law had been subtly but persistently pressuring her to make changes that would benefit them financially. She'd been feeling guilty for resisting their suggestions, wondering if she was being selfish or stubborn. Your story made me realize that trusting my instincts isn't selfish, she said. It's survival. After we hung up, I realized that sharing my story publicly had been the right choice. If it helped even one person avoid what I'd gone through, it was worth the loss of privacy. Tuesday morning, Detective Morrison called with an update. The plea negotiations are moving quickly, he said. Kevin is looking at 18 months in prison plus 3 years probation. Brittany is looking at 12 months plus probation. They'll also be required to pay restitution for your medical expenses and counseling. What about the financial fraud charges? Those are being dropped in exchange for the guilty pleas on the abuse charges. It's not ideal, but it guarantees convictions and jail time without putting you through a lengthy trial. When will this be finalized? Probably within the next 2 weeks. Their lawyers want this resolved quickly, and frankly, so does the prosecutor. Your case is so well documented that taking it to trial would be a waste of resources. That afternoon, I called a travel agent. I want to take a cruise, I told her. Somewhere warm, somewhere I can relax and not think about anything stressful for a while. How does the Mediterranean sound? We have a lovely 14-day cruise leaving from Barcelona in February. It hits all the classic ports: Rome, Florence, Athens, Istanbul. That sounds perfect. Will you be traveling alone? Yes, and I'm very much looking forward to it. After I booked the cruise, I called Dr. Walsh to discuss travel vaccines and medical clearances. Then I called Linda to tell her my plans. Margaret, that's wonderful. You deserve a vacation after everything you've been through. I keep thinking Frank would have loved this cruise. We talked about seeing the Mediterranean someday. So, take him with you, Linda said softly. Take his memory. Take the love you shared. Take all the dreams you made together. Just because he's not physically there doesn't mean he can't be part of the experience. That evening, I pulled out the photo albums Frank and I had made during our 42 years together. I found pictures of us at Niagara Falls during our honeymoon, at the Grand Canyon when Kevin was 10, at Kevin's graduation from college. Looking at them didn't make me sad the way it used to. Instead, it reminded me that I'd had 42 years of happiness with someone who loved me genuinely and unconditionally. Kevin and Brittany had tried to steal my future, but they couldn't steal my past. And now that I was free from them, my future was mine to design. I was going to make it count. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in a courthouse conference room watching Kevin and Brittany enter guilty pleas when I learned something that changed everything I thought I knew about their plan. The plea hearing was routine. Kevin pled guilty to elder abuse and assault. Brittany pled guilty to elder abuse and assault. Both accepted the negotiated sentences, 18 months for Kevin, 12 months for Brittany, plus probation and restitution. But as we were leaving the courthouse, Detective Morrison pulled me aside. Mrs. Thompson, there's something else you should know. During the investigation, we executed a search warrant on Kevin and Brittany's house. We found some things that weren't part of the original case, but they might interest you. What kind of things? Financial documents, insurance policies, and evidence that this wasn't their first attempt at elder abuse. He handed me a manila envelope. Marcus has copies of everything, but I thought you might want to see this yourself. I waited until I got home to open the envelope. Inside were photocopies of documents that made my blood run cold. The first was a life insurance policy on Frank that I'd never seen before. Kevin was listed as the beneficiary, and it had been purchased 3 months before Frank died. The premium payments came from an account I didn't recognize. The second was a series of emails between Kevin and someone named David Chen. Not my lawyer, but apparently a private investigator. The emails discussed accelerating timeline and eliminating obstacles and making it look natural. The third was a credit report on me, run without my knowledge, showing my assets, debts, and financial history in detail. But the fourth document was what made me sit down hard in Frank's chair and struggle to breathe normally. It was a copy of my will, the one Frank and I had made 10 years ago, leaving everything to Kevin. But someone had been making handwritten notes in the margins, calculating asset values, and discussing how to expedite the inheritance process. I called Marcus immediately. "Marcus, I need you to come over here right now. I think Kevin and Brittany were planning more than just financial fraud." He arrived 20 minutes later and reviewed the documents with the same growing horror I'd felt. "Margaret, this suggests they may have been involved in Frank's death. Frank died of a heart attack. Natural causes. Did he have any life insurance policies you didn't know about?" "No. We had one small policy through his work, but nothing like this." I showed him the policy paperwork. "This is for $200,000, Marcus. We never could have afforded premiums like this. And look at the date it was purchased, 3 months before Frank died, right after his cancer went into remission and his prognosis improved." I felt sick. "You think they killed him?" "I think we need to turn this over to Detective Morrison immediately and let the police investigate. But yes, I think it's possible." The next few days were a nightmare of interviews, investigations, and revelations that kept getting worse. Detective Morrison brought in specialists from the homicide division. Frank's body was exhumed for additional testing. Kevin and Brittany's financial records were examined going back 5 years. What the investigators found painted a picture of a couple who had been planning to exploit and potentially murder elderly family members for years. The private investigator, David Chen, had been hired to research insurance fraud techniques that would be difficult to detect. Kevin and Brittany had taken out life insurance policies on 3 elderly relatives: Frank, Brittany's grandmother, and Kevin's uncle. Frank's uncle had died 6 months before Frank, supposedly of complications from diabetes. But the new autopsy revealed traces of insulin that suggested deliberate overdose. Brittany's grandmother had died a year before that, supposedly of natural causes related to her age. But financial records showed that Brittany had been her primary caregiver during her final weeks, and that she'd inherited $90,000 that had paid for Kevin and Brittany's down payment on their house. "They've been doing this for at least 3 years, Detective Morrison told me during one of our interviews, targeting elderly family members who had assets but were vulnerable due to health problems or isolation." And Frank? The new autopsy found evidence of digitalis poisoning. Digitalis is a heart medication that's virtually undetectable in standard toxicology screens, especially if someone already has heart problems. A small overdose would cause cardiac arrest that would look completely natural. I thought about Frank's final weeks, how Kevin had suddenly become so attentive, visiting daily, bringing medications when Frank was too weak to go to the pharmacy himself, how concerned he'd been about Frank's forgetfulness with his medication schedule, insisting that someone needed to supervise his pills. "Kevin was managing Frank's medications," I said quietly. "We figured the digitalis would have been easy to hide in his regular heart medications. A few extra pills dissolved in water, mixed into his evening medications. Frank would have felt chest pains, shortness of breath, and then cardiac arrest, classic heart attack symptoms for someone with his medical history." Morrison paused, watching my face carefully. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to ask you something. After Frank died, did Kevin and Brittany show any interest in your medications or medical care?" I thought back to their suggestions about medication management, their offers to organize my pill dispensers, their insistence that I needed someone to monitor my health conditions. "Yes," I said. "They kept saying I needed help managing my medications and medical appointments. They wanted to be more involved in my healthcare decisions. Because if their abuse plan hadn't worked to gain control of your finances, they probably would have moved to Plan B. Plan B. Murder me the same way they'd murdered Frank and the others, collect life insurance money, and inherit whatever assets I had left." The thought that I'd come that close to dying, not just from abuse, but from premeditated murder, left me shaky and nauseated for days. But it also filled me with a fierce pride in my own survival instincts. Something had told me not to trust them completely. Something had warned me to be careful, to document everything, to plan my escape route. That something had probably saved my life. The new charges against Kevin and Brittany were filed a week later. Murder in the first degree for Frank, Brittany's grandmother, and Kevin's uncle. Attempted murder for the plot against me. Insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, Their bail was revoked immediately. They were looking at life in prison without possibility of parole. I was sitting in my living room reading the news coverage when Linda called. "Margaret, are you okay? I just saw the news about Kevin. Murder charges?" "I'm okay," I said, and realized I meant it. "I'm angry and heartbroken and shocked, but I'm okay." "How are you handling the fact that they killed Frank?" I'd been thinking about that question for days. How do you process the knowledge that your son murdered your husband and planned to murder you? "I think part of me always knew something was wrong," I said. "Not that Kevin was capable of murder, but that Frank's death was convenient for him. The timing, the way Kevin immediately started pushing me to make changes, the way he seemed more interested in my assets than my grief. What happens now? Now I try to rebuild my life again. But this time, I do it knowing that I can trust my own instincts completely." After we hung up, I looked around the living room where Frank and I had spent so many evenings together, where I'd grieved his death for months, never suspecting that it wasn't natural. I should have felt angry. I should have felt devastated by the betrayal and the loss. Instead, I felt something unexpected: relief, because now I knew the truth. Frank hadn't just died and left me alone. He'd been taken from me by someone who saw our love and our life together as an obstacle to their greed. And I'd survived. Not just survived, but fought back successfully against the people who destroyed the person I loved most. Frank would have been proud of me. 6 months later, I was standing on the deck of a cruise ship in the Mediterranean, watching the sun set over the Greek islands, when I got the call from Detective Morrison. "Mrs. Thompson, I wanted to let you know that the trial is over. Kevin was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life without parole. Brittany got life as well, but with the possibility of parole after 30 years. How do you feel about that?" I asked, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. "Justice was served. They'll never hurt anyone else the way they hurt you and Frank." After I hung up, I stood at the ship's railing and thought about everything that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I'd been a grieving widow being manipulated by her son. 6 months ago, I'd been a victim of domestic abuse, fighting for my survival. Today, I was a woman traveling alone through one of the most beautiful places on earth, financially secure and emotionally free. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been therapy sessions to deal with the trauma of abuse and betrayal. There had been legal proceedings that forced me to relive the worst months of my life repeatedly. There had been moments of overwhelming sadness when I missed Frank so intensely that I wondered if I'd ever feel whole again. But there had also been discoveries. I'd learned that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. I'd learned that survival sometimes requires careful planning and strategic thinking, not just endurance. I'd learned that starting over at 67 was not only possible but liberating. The cruise had been everything I'd hoped it would be. I'd visited ruins in Athens, art galleries in Florence, and markets in Istanbul. I'd eaten foods Frank and I had talked about trying someday. I'd taken hundreds of photographs and bought souvenirs that would remind me of places I'd seen with my own eyes. But more importantly, I'd met people, other travelers, especially other women traveling alone who had stories of their own about survival and reinvention. Women who had left abusive marriages, women who had started new careers after their children grew up, women who had refused to disappear quietly into elderly invisibility. One of them was Sarah, a retired teacher from Oregon who had left her husband after 40 years of marriage when she realized he was systematically isolating her from friends and family. "People kept asking me why I waited so long to leave," she told me over dinner in Rome, "as if there's an expiration date on deciding you deserve better." Another was Patricia, a former nurse from Canada who had moved across the country after her adult children tried to pressure her into signing over her house for her own safety. "They kept saying they were worried about me," she said as we toured the Sistine Chapel. "But they were really worried about their inheritance. Once I realized that, leaving became easy." These conversations reminded me that my story wasn't unique. Elder abuse was more common than most people realized, and it was often perpetrated by the very family members who were supposed to be protectors and caretakers. But it also reminded me that survival was possible, and that life after trauma could be not just bearable, but beautiful. On my final night aboard the ship, I was invited to join the captain's table for dinner. It was an honor reserved for passengers who had made the cruise special in some way. though I wasn't sure what I'd done to earn the invitation. Captain Rodriguez was a charming man in his 50s who had been sailing for 30 years. During dinner, he asked about my travels and my plans for the future. "This is my first time traveling alone," I told him. "My husband died 2 years ago, and I thought I might be too nervous to enjoy it, but it's been wonderful." "Solo travel can be intimidating at first," he agreed, "but many of our happiest passengers are women traveling independently. There's something liberating about exploring the world on your own terms." After dinner, he walked me to the deck, and we stood looking out at the lights of Barcelona, where the cruise would end tomorrow. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "I don't know your story, but I can tell that you've been through something difficult. I've seen a lot of people over the years, and I recognize someone who has survived hardship and come out stronger. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's learned to recognize it. You have the bearing of a woman who has faced down something frightening and refused to be broken by it." "I suppose I have." "Good for you. Too many people let difficult experiences defeat them. You've chosen to let yours transform you instead." The next morning, as I disembarked in Barcelona with my luggage and my hundreds of photographs, I realized that Captain Rodriguez was right. The woman who had boarded this ship 2 weeks ago was not the same woman who was leaving it. The cruise, Margaret had been angry, grieving, and still processing trauma. The woman walking down the gangplank was peaceful, confident, and ready for whatever came next. I spent 3 days in Barcelona before flying home, visiting museums and cafes and small shops that sold books in languages I didn't understand. I ate breakfast on outdoor terraces and dinner at restaurants where I was the only solo diner, and I loved every minute of it. On the flight home, I made a list of things I wanted to do next. I wanted to volunteer at a domestic violence shelter, using my experience to help other women escape abusive situations. I wanted to travel more, maybe taking a photography class so I could better capture the places I visited. I wanted to reconnect with old friends and make new ones. Most importantly, I wanted to live fully in a way that honored both Frank's memory and my own survival. When I landed at the airport, Mrs. Peterson was there to pick me up. I'd asked her to instead of taking a taxi because I realized I was ready to start accepting help from people who genuinely cared about me. "Margaret!" she exclaimed as I came through the arrival gate. "You look wonderful, tan and relaxed and years younger." "I feel wonderful," I said, and meant it. As we drove home through familiar streets, Mrs. Peterson filled me in on neighborhood news. The Johnsons had divorced. The Millers had a new grandchild. The house 2 streets over had sold to a young family with twins. "And that boy of yours made the news again," she said as we pulled into my driveway. "Kevin, there was an article in the paper about the trial, about how they caught him and that wife of his because you were smart enough to record everything. You're quite the local celebrity now." I looked at my house, my clean, safe, secure house with its new locks and well-tended garden that Mrs. Peterson had maintained while I was gone. This was home. Not a place where I was tolerated or managed or exploited, but a place where I belonged completely. "Mrs. Peterson," I said, as we carried my luggage to the front door, "would you like to come in for coffee? I have pictures from the trip and stories that are probably more interesting than anything on the evening news." "I would love that, dear." As I unlocked my front door and welcomed my neighbor into my home, I realized that this was how my new life would be built, not around the people who had tried to use me, but around the people who genuinely valued me. It had taken me 67 years to learn that lesson, but I'd learned it well, and I was going to make the rest of my life count. 6 months after that Christmas dinner, when I'd walked through the door with my broken arm and a hidden recorder, I was free, safe, and happier than I'd been since Frank died. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let the people who hurt you destroy your capacity for joy. I chose joy, and it made all the difference. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.